Hi, welcome to the channel. I want to take a moment to look back on the first album of music that I made with the no input mixing board and share some comments and reflections from that time. At the beginning of 2024, I was deep in the process of developing my personal approach to the mixing board as a feedback or no input instrument. And out of that development, I created my first album of music titled Feedback Mixing. I'm really quite proud of the work that I did on that album. And so, before I release any more music, I'd like to present some commentary on my earliest work. Feedback Mixing is available on my Bandcamp page, and I invite you to listen to it alongside this commentary if you haven't listened to it already. Going into reflections on this album, I want to start by talking about the purpose of an album, as I see it. For me, the purpose of an album is to be a sort of constructed snapshot of musical technique and musical thinking. It sort of captures a particular spot on my musical journey. And this first album, Feedback Mixing, was for me all about capturing a snapshot of those techniques with the no input mixing board and also ideas that I was having about noise and the experience of noise and just what exactly noise can be. I think that noise can be intense, but it can also be incredibly delicate. Noise includes both incredibly natural, organic sounds as well as deeply synthetic sounds that are unfamiliar and produced. All of this comes together into what I call a broad noise ecology, a sort of landscape of noise full of all sorts of different inhabitants. And I wanted to communicate this idea of a broad noise ecology through the sounds that I constructed for the album. All of the sounds for the album were recorded using this mixing board here, my Mackie 1202 VLZ. This was my first mixing board that I got for no input style mixing. This was the mixing board that I figured out a lot of my early process of how I wanted to approach the mixing board as an instrument. The album contains 8 tracks, although 5 of them are grouped together into sort of one piece that was recorded all at once. And so there are really 4 pieces on the album that I'm going to talk about. They are ceramics, retention pond drainage structure, picture of a picture of a picture, and finally, a heavy blanket. The first track on the album, Ceramics, was something that I wanted to open with to present that delicate side of noise, and in particular to show a technique with the mixing board that I describe as pinging a resonant channel, similar to the way that in other forms of synthesis you would describe pinging a filter. The plucky resonance and physicality and almost tactile nature of the sound on ceramics, I think, presents part of the no input mixing board sound palette that can be very surprising. And so I wanted to start there. To sort of give you a sense of how that sound is constructed here, I thought I would go ahead and remake that sound a little bit. With enough feedback, the mixing board will produce a tone. And just before you get to that point of feedback, you have an incredibly resonant channel that is on the edge of a threshold. It's almost oscillating. And if you excite that resonant channel if you disturb it in some way, disturb that fragile equilibrium that it's currently suspended in, you can produce a really beautiful tone. So I'm going to take this pulse here. And I'm going to send some of that to the resonant channel. You can hear how incredibly fragile it is, but also so incredibly beautiful, I think. And that's the core sound, the core idea of ceramics. From there, the second piece on the album is called Retention Pond Drainage Structure. This piece comes from, quite literally, a retention pond drainage structure. I was out for a walk in a nearby park. Some friends had taken us there to look at the birds. And the birds were lovely, but there was also this big concrete structure out on the water. And I think at that particular time, it had rained quite a bit recently. And so you had all of this water flowing into these massive concrete chambers where the pouring water would sort of echo and amplify. Because I was thinking so much about noise at the time, I was really struck by how beautiful the noise was that was coming out of this structure. And so a little while later, I came back with a field recorder and I tried to record some of that. And while the recording that I got, I don't think is a perfectly high fidelity recording of the particular sound in isolation, it actually ended up capturing as a field recording a variety of noises all together. The wind, the drainage structure, birds, planes flying overhead, cars from the road. And all of this together became an additional noise palette to play the mixing board against. After making this field recording, bringing it into my audio software and structuring some of it as a piece about 8 minutes long, I started to improvise with the mixing board alongside of this structure. And what I really love about this piece is the ambiguity that you get between the field recording and the mixing board. I think there are parts where you can very clearly pick out what the field recording is and what the mixing board is. But in between that, there's so many pieces of sound that are difficult to attribute to only one source or the other source. In this juxtaposition of mixing board and field recording, I think that it lets us see each of these noise palettes in a new way. The third piece on the album is called A Picture of a Picture of a Picture. And as I was thinking about how I wanted to present my work with the mixing board, I felt it important to represent the mixing board not only as an originator of sound, but also as a processor of sound, particularly in the way that it can shape and distort sound. And so a picture of a picture of a picture becomes the process of capturing distortion through a repeated process. A recording is made with the mixing board, and then that recording is brought back into the mixing board for additional layers of feedback, shaping, and distortion to be applied to it, saved to a new audio file. And then this new distorted audio file is brought into the mixing board again, shaped, processed, distorted, exported, and then brought back into the mixing board one more time. And what you get is a demonstration of distortion, both as a destructive process. Information is reduced compared to the original recording. But you also get to see distortion as a process of augmentation. Information is added with each layer of the recording. And in the end, you end up with a very big sound before finally, at the end of the piece, we get the original first recording from the mixing board played one more time. This piece was inspired by a piece of visual art, our sort of new media art that does this process with, I believe, a picture and also a photocopier. And I cannot, for the life of me, find the original art piece that I was introduced to many years ago that demonstrated this process of distortion through mediation. I know that this is a little unscholarly of me to not have this original citation. And if you know what I'm talking about, please let me know the name of this piece, because it's driven me a little bit bananas. And so ceramics, retention pond drainage structure, a picture of a picture of a picture, all are meant to sort of constellate together to capture different facets of the mixing board and the way that I was approaching it at that time. And I see these first three pieces as leading the listener on a path towards the final piece, which is a heavy blanket. And this is, for me, a really interesting piece, because when I was first working on the album that became Feedback Mixing, my original ideas for it were quite different than where I ended up. I originally saw myself using the mixing board to generate a bunch of sonic material that would then be more meticulously processed and composed into a set of pieces that were much more inspired by tape music. After exploring that approach for a little while, I found that I was struggling to bring things together in a way that felt right for the type of work that I was doing. And at the same time, I was also wrapping up January, where I was recording improvisations and small continuous pieces every day. And so to get myself out of that rut that I felt like I was in for the album, I ended up recording a longer improvisation, an extended performance, just to try and shake things up, to approach the mixing board in a different way. And after recording that 23-minute improvisation, I realized that this was the thing that I wanted to present with the album. The mixing board much more directly needed to be sort of captured and articulated on the album, rather than chopping up and decontextualizing all the little pieces of it. In recording A Heavy Blanket, I really had a clarification for me of what I wanted my relationship to my instrument to be. And that I wanted a relationship particularly with an instrument, that the DAW was not the primary tool that I was using. And it also, I think, really clarified a change that was happening in my definition of music, which I've come to now to really see that music is the sound that you make on your instrument. And there are many ways to capture that, but I realized in recording A Heavy Blanket that it didn't have to be nearly as complicated as I was making it out to be. And so A Heavy Blanket was the first piece that was recorded for the album. And once I had it recorded, I think I sort of knew what the album was. And the rest of my recording work was set out to be creating the rest of the pieces that bring the listener to that first piece and that round out the presentation of the mixing board beyond that improvisation. Much of the material that I was working with for this initial vision of the album that I put aside to focus on the mixing board as an instrument, all these little pieces that I intended to cut up and work with, all of that ended up becoming the sample pack that I released alongside the album. And I think that there's some really beautiful sounds in there, but I think they're much more useful as samples to be taken out and worked with in an isolated context, rather than in full the material for the album that I wanted to be working on at the time. And so all of these pieces come together to be a snapshot of a particular time, the beginning of 2024, for me in my musical process. I will always love feedback mixing as an album because I can point to it and say, this is what I sounded like at the beginning of 2024. And also, this is what I was thinking about at that time, as it is expressed through music and the construction of an album. And I'm doing that process again now. Something like 6 months have passed since the release of feedback mixing. It's now September of 2024. And there's so much that has developed for me, both with my techniques in music and my thinking about music. I'm excited to share with you all, when it comes out, the musical expression of the techniques that I've been developing that you've seen in many of the videos since March, but also the musical thinking that I've been doing, which doesn't express itself quite so clearly in the short videos that I release here. And so if you're enjoying my YouTube channel, the best way to support it is to support my music on Bandcamp. This channel will always be a place where I freely share my experiments and explorations to document my musical process, and also to share the insights and reflections that I have while I'm making my way through that process. And the music that I release on Bandcamp will always be the final object through which support can be expressed. If you have any questions about feedback mixing or my music, feel free to ask in the comments here. I always love talking with people. And yeah, that's mostly it. I wanted to get these thoughts articulated, reflect a little bit on feedback mixing, and get it all shaken out before my new album comes out. Go listen to my music. I hope you like it. And I hope you have a good day.